The laughter hit me like shards of glass, each jagged edge slicing deeper than the last. I stood there, clutching a wine glass that felt too heavy in my hand, the golden liquid inside trembling as if it sensed the storm brewing in the room. The graduation cap on the mantelpiece stared back at me, its tassel swaying lazily in the air-conditioned breeze, a symbol of my son's achievement that should have been the centerpiece of the evening. Instead, it felt like a prop in some twisted play where I was the punchline. Nancy's voice cut through the room, sharp and deliberate, as she regaled her friends with another story I'd heard 100 times before. "Oh, you should have seen him trying to assemble that grill last summer," she chirped, her wine glass raised like a trophy. 3 hours and a trip to the ER later, he finally admitted he'd put the legs on backward. The room erupted in laughter, but not the warm, genuine kind. This was the kind that made my stomach churn, the kind that felt like a collective jab at my expense. I forced a smile, the kind that doesn't reach your eyes, and took a sip of wine that tasted more like vinegar than celebration. My son, Jack, stood across the room, his face a mix of pride and discomfort. He caught my eye and gave me a small nod, the kind that said, "Hang in there, Dad." But even that couldn't drown out the sound of Nancy's voice, now dripping with mockery as she moved on to my midlife crisis attempt at learning guitar. "The neighbors called the cops, thinking someone was torturing a cat," she said, and the room roared again. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the wallpaper, to become one with the graduation decorations that hung limply from the ceiling. But I stayed rooted in place, my feet glued to the hardwood floor as if mocking me for not having the courage to walk away. The laughter swirled around me, a cacophony of voices that blended into a single, deafening roar. My hands clenched around the wine glass, the stem threatening to snap under the pressure. And then it hit me, not the laughter, but the realization. This wasn't just harmless teasing. This was calculated. The way Nancy's eyes flicked toward me after each joke, the way her friends followed her lead like a pack of hyenas. They weren't laughing with her. They were laughing at me, and she knew it. I glanced at the graduation cap again, its tassel now perfectly still, a symbol of achievement, of new beginnings. But for me, it felt like the end of something. A life I thought I'd built, a marriage I thought was solid. The wine glass trembled in my hand once more, and I set it down before I did something I'd regret. The laughter followed me as I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air hitting my face like a slap. But it wasn't enough to wash away the sting. Not even close. The room was a blur of noise and motion, but all I could focus on was the weight of my son's hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, grounding me in a way nothing else could. I turned to look at him, and the expression on his face stopped me cold. His eyes were dark, serious, the kind of look that makes your stomach drop before you even know why. "Dad," he said, his voice low, almost drowned out by the clinking glasses and laughter behind us. "We need to talk." "Not here." I nodded, my throat suddenly dry, and followed him down the hallway, away from the party. The graduation cap he'd been wearing earlier was tucked under his arm like an afterthought. Every step felt heavier, like the air itself was pushing back against me. He opened the door to his old bedroom, the one we turned into a guest room after he moved out, and closed it behind us with a soft click. The room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. My son stood by the window, his back to me for a moment, his shoulders tense. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, his jaw tight. "Dad," he started again, then stopped, like the words were stuck in his throat. He ran a hand through his hair, the same nervous habit he'd had since he was a kid. I don't know how to tell you this." My chest tightened. "Just say it," I urged, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "It's Mom. She's been lying to you. For a long time." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and jagged. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut, but I forced myself to stay still, to keep my face neutral. "Lying about what?" He looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She's been seeing someone. Client. Some rich guy she met through work. It's not just work trips, Dad. It's more than that." The room seemed to tilt around me, the walls closing in. I grabbed the edge of the dresser to steady myself, my knuckles turning white. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but it was like trying to catch smoke with my hands. How long? I asked, my voice barely audible. A year. Maybe more, he said, his voice cracking. I didn't want to believe it either, but I saw them, Dad, at a restaurant. They weren't just talking. The image flashed in my mind. Nancy laughing, her hand on some stranger's arm, leaning in too close. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to punch the wall. Why didn't you tell me sooner? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. He looked at me, his eyes filled with guilt. I didn't know how. I didn't want to hurt you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. Not after tonight, seeing how they treated you. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. The laughter from the party still echoed faintly through the walls, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to another world. A world where I wasn't the fool, the punchline to a joke I didn't even know I was part of. My son stepped closer, his hand on my shoulder again, grounding me once more. I'm sorry, Dad, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just thought you deserved to know. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. My mind was a storm, swirling with questions and emotions I couldn't untangle. But through it all, one thought stood out, sharp and clear. This wasn't just about Nancy. This was about me, and I wasn't going to let her destroy everything I'd worked for. The door creaked softly as my son left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stared at the closed door, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. The truth was out now, and nothing would ever be the same. The room felt like it was tilting, the walls closing in as my son's words hung in the air like a noose. I could hear the faint hum of the party still going on downstairs, the clink of glasses and the occasional burst of laughter, but it all sounded distant, like I was underwater. My vision blurred, and I blinked hard, trying to steady myself. My son's voice was low, urgent, like he was afraid someone might overhear, but every word cut deeper than the last. Dad, she's been seeing someone for months, one of her clients. I didn't want to tell you, but I couldn't keep it to myself anymore. My chest tightened, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a train track, watching the headlights grow brighter, knowing I couldn't move. I gripped the edge of the dresser, my knuckles white, and stared at the crumpled photo in my hand. Some old family vacation shot, all smiles and sunshine. It felt like a cruel joke now, a relic from a life that had been a lie. Who? My voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. My son hesitated, his face pale, like he was afraid of what I might do. Who is it? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Some guy from her firm. Rich, obviously. She's been using her trips as a cover. All those late nights, the business dinners. It wasn't work, Dad. It was him. The room spun, and I sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, the photo still clenched in my fist. My mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments. All the time she'd come home late, smelling of wine and perfume. The way she'd brush off my questions with a laugh or a dismissive wave. I chalked it up to stress, to her demanding job. I trusted her. God, I trusted her. My son sat beside me, his hand on my shoulder, but I barely felt it. All I could think about was the nights I'd spent alone, the way she'd grown distant, the way she'd look at me sometimes, like I was a stranger in my own home. And all the while she'd been with him, using me, using our marriage as a cover for her own selfish desires. I'm sorry, Dad, my son said softly. I didn't want to hurt you, but you deserve to know. I nodded numbly, my throat too tight to speak. The photo in my hand was crumpled beyond recognition now, the edges digging into my palm. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. The sound of the party downstairs drifted up again, and I closed my eyes, trying to block it out. But all I could see was her smile, her laugh, the way she'd looked at me when we first met, like I was the only person in the world. And now all I could think about was how she'd looked at him, how she'd lied to my face, day after day, while I'd been too blind to see it. My son's voice broke through the fog. What are you going to do? I opened my eyes, staring at the floor. The train was coming, and there was no way to stop it. But I wasn't going to stand on the tracks and let it run me over. Not this time. I don't know, I said finally, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. But I'm not going to let her get away with this. The mirror stared back at me, but the man in it was a stranger. His eyes were hollow, his face etched with lines I didn't recognize. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass, as if the steam might reveal the person I used to be. The one who believed in love, in loyalty, in the idea that marriage was a sanctuary. That man was gone, and all that remained was this shell, fractured and brittle, holding itself together by sheer will. The whiskey glass sat empty on the counter, its amber residue clinging to the bottom like a stain I couldn't scrub away. I poured another, the liquid catching the dim light from the hallway. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, each second a hammer blow to my skull. Time didn't care about my pain. It just kept moving, indifferent, while I stood there, frozen in a storm of emotions I couldn't untangle. Anger was the easiest to grab onto. It burned hot and bright, a wildfire in my chest. I wanted to smash the glass, to scream until my throat was raw, to tear apart the life we'd built together and watch it crumble. But beneath that rage was something colder, darker. A sadness so deep it felt like drowning. How could she do this? How could she look me in the eye, day after day, and lie so effortlessly? I thought about the nights she'd come home late, her perfume faint but unmistakable. I thought about the excuses, work dinners, networking events, late meetings. I believed her. I trusted her. And all the while she was with him. The image of them together flashed in my mind, unbidden and cruel. His hands on her, his laugh in her ear, the two of them tangled in a betrayal that felt like a knife twisting in my gut. I slammed the glass down, the sound echoing through the empty house. My reflection flinched, and for a moment, I hated that man in the mirror. Hated his weakness, his naivety, his inability to see what was right in front of him. But then the anger shifted, turned inward. What kind of man lets this happen? What kind of man stands by while his wife destroys everything they've built? The clock ticked on, a relentless reminder that the night was slipping away. I could feel the storm inside me building, the quiet before the chaos. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I couldn't just sit here and let her win. She thought she was untouchable, that she could lie and cheat and walk away unscathed. But she was wrong. I picked up the glass again, swirling the whiskey as if it might hold the answers. The liquid caught the light, golden and deceptive, just like her. I drained it in one swallow, the burn a small comfort in the cold void of the night. The mirror still stared back at me, but now I saw something else. A glint of resolve, a spark of the man I used to be. He wasn't gone after all. He was just buried under the weight of her lies. And as the clock ticked on, I made a silent promise to myself. I would dig him out, no matter what it took. The glow from the laptop screen was the only light in the room, casting long shadows across the walls. Ethan sat hunched over the keyboard, his fingers moving with a precision that felt almost mechanical. The spreadsheet before him was a labyrinth of numbers, dates, and cryptic notes. Each cell a tiny piece of a puzzle he was determined to solve. His red pen hovered over a stack of bank statements, circling transactions that didn't add up. A $5,000 withdrawal from their joint account last October. A series of mysterious deposits into Nancy's personal savings. A maxed-out credit card he hadn't even known existed. He paused, rubbing his temples. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the laptop fan and the occasional scratch of his pen. Outside, the rain tapped against the window, a steady rhythm that matched the pounding in his chest. He hadn't slept in days, but sleep felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not when every document he uncovered seemed to lead him deeper into a maze of lies. Nancy's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and mocking. "You're so naive, Ethan. Always have been." He clenched his jaw, the memory of her laughter at the party still fresh. But this wasn't about her anymore. This was about survival, about protecting what was left of his dignity and his son. He opened a new tab, pulling up emails she'd sent from her work account. She'd been careless, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs in her rush to hide the truth. Hotel reservations, dinner receipts, a $12,000 charge for a weekend at a luxury resort, paid for by her so-called client. Ethan's stomach churned as he scrolled through the messages, each one a dagger to his already battered heart. He didn't need to read between the lines to know what had happened. The dates lined up perfectly with her business trips. The excuses she'd given, late meetings, networking events, now felt like punches to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The anger was there, simmering just beneath the surface, but it was tempered by something colder, more calculated. He wasn't going to scream. He wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. Instead, he opened another spreadsheet, this one labeled Plan B. It was a list of every asset they owned, every debt they shared, every financial move she'd made in the last 5 years. He'd spent hours cross-referencing dates, amounts, and account numbers, piecing together a picture of her betrayal that was as meticulous as it was damning. The red pen moved again, underlining a particularly suspicious transfer. A $20,000 withdrawal from their retirement fund, labeled as an investment. He knew better. Nancy had never been interested in investments. She'd always been more interested in appearances. Designer clothes, expensive dinners, the kind of lifestyle that made her friends green with envy. And now, it seemed she'd been willing to sell more than just her integrity to maintain it. Ethan's hand trembled as he saved the document, labeling it with today's date. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with all this information yet, but he knew one thing for certain. Nancy wasn't going to walk away unscathed. She'd spent years building her perfect life on a foundation of lies, and he was going to make sure she felt every crack as it crumbled beneath her. He glanced at the clock. 3:47 a.m. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt almost oppressive. For a moment, he considered closing the laptop, crawling into bed, and pretending none of this was real. But then he thought of his son. His quiet strength, the way he'd pulled him aside at the party, his voice trembling as he revealed the truth. Ethan couldn't let him down. Not again. With a deep breath, he opened a new document and began typing. A letter. Not to Nancy, but to her lover's wife. It was short, to the point, and dripping with the kind of cold, calculated precision that only someone who'd been pushed too far could muster. He printed it out, along with a carefully curated selection of bank statements and emails, and sealed them in a plain white envelope. As he stood to leave, the laptop's glow reflected off the empty whiskey glass on the desk. He hesitated, then poured himself one last drink. The burn in his throat was a welcome distraction from the storm raging in his chest. Tomorrow he'd mail the envelope. Tomorrow the first domino would fall. Tonight, he'd let himself feel the weight of what was coming. And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, bitter smile. The parking lot of the post office was nearly empty, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. My hands were steady as I gripped the manila envelope, the weight of it heavier than it should have been. Inside was a carefully curated collection of truths, photos, bank statements, receipts, and a handwritten note that tied it all together like a noose. I'd spent weeks piecing it together, cross-referencing dates, transactions, and locations until the picture was so clear it burned. Nancy's laughter from that night at the graduation party still echoed in my head, sharp and mocking, like nails scraping against glass. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see her smirking over her wine glass, surrounded by her friends who thought her cruelty was hilarious. That sound, that image, it fueled me. The envelope was addressed to her. Not Nancy, the other woman, the wife of the man who'd been sneaking into my life, uninvited, for who knows how long. I didn't know much about her, only what I'd gathered from a few discreet searches. Her name, her address, the fact that she volunteered at her kids' school and posted pictures of family vacations on social media. She seemed normal, unassuming, the kind of woman who probably trusted her husband too much, just like I had. But that wasn't my problem. My problem was making sure she knew what her husband and Nancy had been up to. I hesitated for a moment at the mailbox, my fingers brushing the cold metal slot. The smirk on my face felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. I wasn't the kind of guy who did things like this, or at least I hadn't been. But the man I used to be was gone, buried under layers of betrayal and humiliation. This new version of me, the one who'd spent nights poring over bank statements and credit card bills, the one who'd driven past Nancy's work dinners just to confirm what I already knew. This version didn't hesitate. I slid the envelope into the slot and listened to the soft thud as it hit the bottom. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. This was the first domino, and once it tipped, there'd be no stopping the cascade. Nancy's perfect little world, the one she'd built on lies and manipulation, was about to come crashing down. I didn't know how the other woman would react, but I didn't need to. All that mattered was that she knew. The rest would take care of itself. As I drove away, I couldn't help but imagine the moment she'd open that envelope. Would she cry, scream, confront him immediately, or would she do what I'd done at first? Bury it, pretend it wasn't real, until the weight of it became too much to carry? Either way, it didn't matter. The truth was out there now, and it was only a matter of time before it reached Nancy. I stopped at a diner on the way home, ordering a coffee I didn't really want. The place was quiet, just an old man reading a newspaper and a waitress wiping down the counter. I sat in a booth by the window, staring at my reflection in the glass. The smirk was gone, replaced by something harder, colder. I didn't feel guilty, not even a little. If anything, I felt lighter, like I'd finally taken control of something after being powerless for so long. By the time I got home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the driveway. The house was dark, empty in a way that felt permanent now. I didn't bother turning on the lights. Instead, I sat in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen, and waited. It wouldn't be long now. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe, and I couldn't wait to see what happened next. The ringing phone sliced through the silence like a knife. I hadn't been sleeping, just lying there, staring at the ceiling, the faint glow of the laptop screen still burning in the corner of the room. The clock on the nightstand blinked 5:47 a.m. I didn't need to look at the caller ID to know who it was. The sound of her voice, shaky and raw, confirmed it. Ethan, I need you. Please. Something's happened. Nancy's words tumbled out in a rush, her breath hitching like she was on the verge of hyperventilating. I sat up slowly, the sheets pooling around me, and let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. The curtains were drawn tight, but a sliver of pale light crept through the gap, cutting across the room like a wound. What is it, Nancy? I kept my voice flat, almost bored, but my free hand clenched into a fist under the covers. I could feel the weight of what was coming, the faint tremor of satisfaction bubbling beneath the surface. It's over. With him. His wife, she knows. She left him, and now he's saying it's my fault. He's cutting me off, Ethan. He's cutting me off. Her voice cracked, and for a second, I thought she might actually cry. Real tears, not the kind she used to manipulate me with. I don't know what to do. I need you to come over. Please. I can't do this alone. I leaned back against the headboard, the cold wood pressing into my spine. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee and the whiskey I'd poured myself hours ago, the glass still sitting half empty on the dresser. Outside, the faint chirp of early birds filtered through the window, a stark contrast to the chaos on the other end of the line. You're not alone, Nancy, I said finally, my voice low and steady. You've got your friends, remember? The ones who laughed at me at the party. The ones who thought it was so funny to see me humiliated in front of our son. Why don't you call one of them? There was a sharp intake of breath, followed by a choked sob. Ethan, please. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But this isn't about us. This is about me. I'm scared. He's saying things. Threatening things. I don't have anyone else to turn to. I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. The desperation in her voice was almost tangible, like I could reach out and touch it. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the spreadsheet on my laptop, the bank statements, the crumpled photo I'd found in her desk drawer. I remembered the way she'd looked at me across the graduation party, her eyes cold and mocking, as her friends laughed at her jokes about my weight, my job, my failures. You'll figure it out, Nancy, I said, my tone softer now, but no less final. You always do. The line went silent for a long moment, and I could practically hear her mind racing, trying to find the right words, the right angle to manipulate me into helping her. But I wasn't the same man she'd walked all over for years. I wasn't the same man who'd let her turn his life into a punchline. Ethan, I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry for everything. Please, just come over. We can talk. We can fix this. I let out a slow breath, my eyes drifting to the clock. 5:52 a.m. The sun would be up soon, but for now, the room was still shrouded in shadows. "No, Nancy," I said quietly. "We can't fix this. You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." I hung up before she could respond, the click of the phone echoing in the stillness. For a long time, I just sat there, listening to the sound of my own breathing, the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I wondered if she'd call someone else. One of her friends, maybe, or her sister. But I doubted it. Nancy had always been too proud to admit her mistakes to anyone but me. And now, even that was gone. I reached for the whiskey glass on the dresser, the amber liquid catching the faint light as I raised it to my lips. The taste was bitter, but it felt right, like the first sip of something long overdue. Outside, the birds were getting louder, their songs rising in a chorus that felt almost triumphant. I set the glass down and leaned back, a small, grim smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Let her panic. Let her scramble. Let her feel the weight of everything she's done. The sun would rise soon, and with it, a new day. But for Nancy, the darkness was just beginning. The divorce papers sat on the kitchen table, their crisp edges catching the early morning light. Ethan stared at them, his fingers tracing the faint indentation of the signature line. The room was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by. He hadn't slept much. The coffee in his mug had long gone cold, its surface a dull, oily sheen. He didn't bother to reheat it. The chill in the air felt fitting somehow, like the house itself had resigned itself to what was coming. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. The evidence was stacked neatly in a folder beside the papers. Bank statements, text messages, and photos that painted a picture so damning it made his stomach turn. Nancy had been meticulous in her betrayal, but Ethan had been more so in uncovering it. Every late-night spreadsheet, every whispered conversation with his lawyer, every moment of doubt he'd pushed through had led to this. And yet, sitting there, he didn't feel the satisfaction he'd expected. There was just a hollow ache, a numbness that made the room feel too big, too empty. Nancy hadn't fought him on it. Not really. When he'd confronted her with the evidence, her face had gone pale, her usual sharpness crumbling into something raw and panicked. She tried to explain, to justify, but the words had fallen flat between them. There was no coming back from this. Not after the lies, the manipulation, the way she'd looked at him that night at the graduation party. Like he was nothing more than a punchline in some cruel joke. He picked up the pen, the weight of it unfamiliar in his hand. For a moment he hesitated. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about reclaiming something. His dignity, his self-respect, the life he'd built before she twisted it into something unrecognizable. He thought about their son, about the way he'd looked at Ethan when he'd told him the truth. That had been the hardest part, knowing his boy had carried that secret, that burden, for so long. But it had also been the push Ethan needed to finally act. The pen touched the paper, and he signed his name in quick, decisive strokes. The ink dried almost immediately, a stark black against the white page. It was done. Nancy's reaction was quieter than he'd expected. When she saw the papers, she didn't scream or cry. She just nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for her own pen. There was a moment, brief but palpable, where she looked at him, really looked at him, and he thought he saw something like regret in her eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the same cold detachment he'd come to know so well. She signed her name, the sound of the pen scratching against the paper echoing in the silence. Ethan slid the papers back into the envelope, his movements deliberate, almost mechanical. He'd already made copies, of course. He wasn't taking any chances. As he sealed the envelope, he felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted. But it was bittersweet. This wasn't the ending he'd imagined when they'd stood at the altar all those years ago, promising to love and cherish each other for better or worse. He left the envelope on the table and walked to the window, staring out at the empty street. The sun was starting to rise, casting long shadows across the lawn. Somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing, its melody sharp and clear. Ethan took a deep breath, the air tasting faintly of dew and the promise of a new day. It was over. and for the first time in a long time he felt like he could finally breathe. The house felt hollow now, like a shell of what it once was. Nancy stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by packing boxes and the faint scent of cardboard. The walls, once adorned with family photos and memories, were bare, save for a single faded wedding photo she hadn't yet taken down. It hung crooked, as if even the frame itself was tired of holding up the lie. She stared at it, her hands trembling as she reached for it, but stopped short. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye, pale, worn, and unrecognizable. She looked away. Ethan watched from the doorway, his arms crossed, leaning against the frame. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The silence between them was louder than any argument they'd ever had. Nancy's voice broke at first, thin and shaky. "You really think you've won, don't you?" she said, her back still turned to him. He didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he stepped inside, his boots echoing on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed to reverberate through the empty rooms, amplifying the emptiness. "Winning wasn't the point," he said finally, his voice steady. "Surviving was." She spun around, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and desperation. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Sending those things to his wife. Ruining everything I—" Her voice cracked, and she looked away, her hands clenching into fists. "You didn't have to do that, Ethan. You didn't have to destroy me." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "You did that yourself, Nancy. I just held up the mirror." She let out a bitter laugh, the sound sharp and brittle in the empty space. "A mirror? Is that what you call it? You think this is some kind of justice? You're just as bad as I am." He shrugged, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe, but at least I can sleep at night." Nancy's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She sank onto one of the boxes, her hands covering her face. For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. When she finally spoke again, her voice was small, almost childlike. "What am I supposed to do now?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He walked over to the faded wedding photo and took it down, holding it for a moment before setting it on the box next to her. "Start over," he said simply. "Like I am." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed and pleading. "You could have forgiven me, Ethan. We could have fixed this." He shook his head slowly, his gaze steady. "Some things can't be fixed." The finality in his voice seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "You'll regret this," she whispered, though the words lacked conviction. Ethan turned to leave, pausing at the doorway. "I already regret a lot of things," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But this isn't one of them." As he walked out, he didn't look back. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, a final punctuation to a chapter that had been written long before today. Nancy sat there for a long time, surrounded by the remnants of the life she'd built and the one she'd destroyed. The silence was deafening. Outside, Ethan stood on the porch, breathing in the cool evening air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. He felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a quiet sense of triumph. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in years, it felt like his own. He climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving the past behind him. The porch swing creaked softly beneath us, its rhythm steady and grounding, like the heartbeat of the house itself. The sun hung low, a fiery orb sinking into the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. It felt like the world was exhaling, letting go of the day's weight. My son sat beside me, his hands clasped between his knees, staring out at the yard. He hadn't said much since the last box was loaded into Nancy's car earlier that afternoon. Neither had I. There wasn't much left to say. The house felt different now. Not empty exactly, but lighter, as if it had been holding its breath for years. The air inside didn't carry the sharp tang of perfume anymore, or the faint echo of her laughter that used to cut through me like a blade. Instead, there was just the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. It was quiet, but not in a way that felt lonely. Felt like peace. I glanced at my son, his profile silhouetted against the fading light. He looked so much like her sometimes, especially in the curve of his jaw and the way his brows knit together when he was thinking. But his eyes, those were mine. And so was the quiet strength he'd shown through all of this. He'd been the one to pull me aside at the party, to tell me the truth when no one else would. He'd been the one to stand by me when the walls started closing in. I didn't know how to tell him how much that meant to me, how much it still meant. "You okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. It was soft, cautious, like he was afraid of stirring up something neither of us wanted to face. I nodded, though the word, okay, didn't quite fit. I wasn't okay, not entirely. But I wasn't broken anymore either. The anger that had fueled me for so long, through the sleepless nights, the spreadsheets, the calculated moves, had burned itself out. What was left was something quieter, something closer to resolve. I'd done what I needed to do. I'd taken back control of my life, piece by shattered piece, and now I was left with the strange, heavy calm that comes after a storm. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice rough. "I think I am." He nodded, his gaze still fixed on the horizon. "She called me," he said after a moment. "Mom, she's not doing great." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to feel something. Anger, satisfaction, pity, but it all felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Nancy had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. Her lover's wife had left him, taking half of everything he owned. His career was in shambles, and Nancy's reputation wasn't far behind. The financial web she'd spun had unraveled completely, leaving her with nothing but the debts she'd tried so hard to hide. It was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? To see her suffer the way I had? But now that it was done, it didn't feel like victory. It just felt over. "She'll figure it out," I said finally. "She always does." My son glanced at me, his expression unreadable. "Do you think she'll ever apologize?" I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Your mother doesn't apologize." "Not really. But it doesn't matter anymore. I'm done waiting for her to change." He nodded again, and for a while we just sat there, the swing rocking gently beneath us. The sky deepened to a rich indigo, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the sound carried on the warm evening air. It felt like the world was moving on, like it always did, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was moving with it. "I'm proud of you, Dad," my son said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look at him, surprised. "Proud of me? For what?" "For standing up for yourself. For not letting her destroy you." He hesitated, then added, "For being strong enough to walk away." I didn't know what to say to that. The truth was, I didn't feel strong. I felt tired, worn down by years of lies and betrayal. But maybe that was what strength looked like. Not some grand, heroic act, but the quiet determination to keep going, even when every part of you wanted to give up. "Thanks, kid," I said finally, my voice thick. "That means a lot." He smiled, a small, tentative thing, and leaned back against the swing, his gaze returning to the sky. The first fireflies of the evening flickered to life in the yard, their tiny lights dancing in the gathering dark. It was a strange kind of beauty, fragile and fleeting, but real in a way that felt grounding. I didn't know what came next. Maybe I'd sell the house, start fresh somewhere new. Maybe I'd stay here, let the memories fade until they were just shadows on the walls. But for now, sitting there with my son, watching the sunset paint the sky with hope, it was enough. It was more than enough.